Alright, so today we're going to talk about waxing. So this is what is done for most of the hard cheeses that we do. Anything that calls for long-term storage is going to be waxed. The wax itself comes in a freezer bag here like this, and you can actually see what it looks like here. What they've actually done is there's multiple layers of it put together, but once they are stuck together, they don't come apart. And so the reason this is an odd shape is because of how I add the wax, which I'll show that here in a little bit. But in between waxing, we have a dedicated pot that we leave it in. And so I have a natural bristle brush here. The wax itself is solidified. And what we'll do initially to get started is just go ahead and start heating it up. Now, wax itself will burn quite well. Once we start heating the wax, I do not leave the kitchen. Right? Period and simple. It's just safer that way. So the wax itself will melt. The solidification point for this particular wax is around 140 to 150 degrees. And so I only know that because I watch it solidify as it cools. So right now it's just at room temperature, so it'll take a few minutes to melt all the way through. And we'll go ahead and add a thermometer once there's some liquid to put it in and monitor it from there. So now we wait.
I bought the pot at a garage sale because I knew that we were never going to get it clean again. That basically, once we put wax in it, there would be wax in it forever. So I'm sure you could also get one fairly inexpensively at a dollar store or a discount store or something like that.
So the wax is completely melted, so we can go ahead and put a thermometer in here. Now this is just a regular food thermometer. Unfortunately, it only goes to 220 degrees, which is a little bit lower than the recommended temperature of the wax, which is 240 degrees. So a candy thermometer is what you would need to be able to measure that high. So for me, I just kind of watch it, and when it gets well above, or at least pretty well past 220, we'll just say that's as close as I can get, and that's what we need. We want that high temperature so that the initial waxing process, as we put the cheese into the wax, will kill any surface bacteria, any surface mold, or any spores that are on the cheese that might be present in your cheese cave or refrigerator that you're using, to minimize the chance of mold growing on the cheese while it's aging. So at this point I'm just above 220. I'm keeping the wax moving so I get a good feel for the temperature of the wax. Now for the waxing itself, if this wax was not enough, I can add to it by basically taking my solid block of wax and just putting it in here, and then I just kind of keep the wax moving, keep the solid block of wax in contact with the bottom where the heat is being added, and that will allow me to add wax as it melts away, which accounts for the odd shape of this block. Once I'm satisfied with the level, and I usually look for a level of about 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch of wax, that's enough in there, and then I can just go ahead and pull that out. So while I'm waxing, I like to use a bowl to set the cheese on in between applications. So the bowl allows me to, basically the wax is going to be outer edge of the cheese, so it does not make any contact with the bowl, and allows my fingers to come up underneath to grab the cheese. So the initial waxing I do is just the outer rim, and I'll just dip it right in, spin it around a couple of times. This makes for a very nice smooth edge on the wax, and I can just pull it up and let the wax drip off. And now there's no wax on the center, so I can hold it, and now I'll go ahead and coat the top part of it with this brush. Make sure all the surfaces are covered there. That first thin coat. So now I can go ahead and just gently place this on the bowl. Give the wax a chance to cool so that I can handle it. Usually just takes about 20 to 30 seconds or so. The cheese itself has been in the cheese cave, so it's at about 55 degrees. There's not a lot of wax relative to the size of the cheese, so it cools fairly quickly to the point where I can handle it. It's not about the wax being too hot, it's about the wax being soft. And I just want to make sure it's solid enough to handle. So we're good now. So now we'll go ahead and flip it over here, and you can see that the wax comes in about ½ an inch or so from the edges. You can see the shiny part there, and the inner part where it's not shiny is where I need to add the wax. And so now the wax is still hot here, so we'll go ahead and spread this on.
And we don't use synthetic plastic brush because if you did, it might melt in the wax. So that's why you want to use a natural brush.
So once the cheese is fully coated in wax, I like to use a piece of paper between it and any surfaces. So I'll put it here to rest while it's cooling and the wax is cooling as well. And this is also how I store it in the cheese cave on the racks. Again, prevents the wax from making contact with it and accidentally removing itself from the cheese when you go in and flip it. So flipping it is very simple. We just kind of peel it off. Right now it's not sticking at all, which is great. You can see there's a little bit of a waxy or an oily spot on the paper itself. But with the paper, it peels right off the cheese without removing any of the wax from the cheese. So at this point, the wax is still at about 240 degrees. I am going to put a second coat on, but the high temperature wax has done the job in its contact with the cheese itself. So at this point, I usually like to let the wax cool a little bit to about 180 to 170 degrees or so, just above the melt point. And that way, it's quicker to cool on the cheese itself, easier to handle. So now we'll just go ahead and wait for the wax itself to cool, and then we'll come back and put a second coat on. Okay, it took about 10 minutes for the wax to cool down to 170 degrees, so we are ready for the second coat, which really is exactly like the first coat in terms of how it's done. So I start with the edges, just kind of roll the cheese around, being careful to not touch the edges with my fingers. And let the wax drip off. Again, holding in the middle here. Now the only difference with the second coat is I go ahead and add a label. So this is just a small piece of paper. I put the name of the cheese, the date of the cheese, and just put a thin coat of wax over it to hold it in place. And then add the second coat, just like the first coat. Trying to smooth everything out. So again, while that wax is cooling, we'll go ahead and just set it here on the paper. Give that a chance to cool enough to handle it. And then once that's done, we'll go ahead and flip it over and put on the second label. I always label both sides because the cheese is always going to be flipped periodically while it's in the cheese cave. And so that way, whatever side is up, I can tell exactly which cheese it is. So now it's cooled enough here, I can go ahead and flip it over. And you can't really see much difference now. It's all shiny. I can see with just the right light, there's a slight ridge where the second coat of wax is on the outside layer. So when I do add the second coat here, I'll make sure I get all the way out to that edge. Kind of smooth and blend it in. And that's it. So now the cheese is waxed. I will sometimes go ahead and weigh it just to get an idea of how much wax I have added. The amount of wax that's added, of course, is going to depend a little bit on the size of the cheese. With multiple layers like that, you do end up with a little bit more wax. Nothing wrong with that.
Tear the scale so that it zeros before you put the cheese on it. That way it doesn't include the weight of the bowl or the paper.
Shade over 30 ounces. Before the waxing, it started out at about 28 and change, about 28.7. So that's about 1.3 ounces of wax that was added, which is typical for what I usually have. So it also gives you an idea of how much longer your wax is going to last. You buy it in about a 2-pound block, so you can figure out how many cheeses it's going to be able to coat. So you can plan ahead as needed. So the cheese is now ready to go down into the cheese cave and age for the amount of time necessary for that particular cheese. This one happens to be a gouda, but the process is exactly the same for cheddar, Havarti, any other cheese that is waxed.